So here's the agenda for this morning here. We've got an hour on the talk. Matt Peterson is the name, and I work at Cumulus Network. So we're going to talk a little bit about the landscape of network automation as it exists today, historically, and ideally the future from three engineers this morning. And look a little bit about some of the implementation details of using network automation, along with some of the cultural changes to facilitate that, and then hopefully a little bit of vendor praise and maybe some vendor bashing that's worked well in these deployments. So I wanted to start off briefly with a recap of where we've been with network automation. One of the things that a lot of folks have done in their career is certainly screen scraping. You look at rancid technology that's been around for well over a decade at this point. Screen scraping is the norm for a lot of organizations, or at least it's the initial starting point for some level of automation. Part of the challenge there is, of course, vendors change the output. There are different formats for different vendor operating systems. Things change. So screen scraping is pretty brittle and certainly fragile. NetConf had a lot of promise. It was quite exciting, again, several years ago. Unfortunately, we really saw niche vendor adoption. Only one particular vendor really took it seriously a number of years ago, and all other vendors are essentially playing catch up at this time. So that's a real, I think, frustration for a lot of folks, is that a great standard, a great specification, but unfortunately kind of minimal support in the real world. Then we see XML, again, technology that made a lot of sense at the time it was developed, but again, not a standard schema that you would see across vendors. So you go back to the challenge of the screen scraping, where the schema or the output is specific to a certain vendor. And more recently, we've seen kind of the Web 2.0 technologies finally applied to networking. RESTful interfaces becoming quite popular. Again, the challenge there is that there's no well-defined schema, but the integration work is essentially a curl call. So it's a very easy initial step to get some proof of concept code up and running. So it's definitely kind of things in the right direction. Again, with the problem that it's not a standardized approach, but the protocol implementation is very easy to get up and going. Now, what's changed in the last couple of years is that, the hardware and software, the applications, the cables, the power supplies, the applications, those are all very tightly coupled. There are a number of organizations that are focused on, decoupling that infrastructure as best as possible. And if you look at compute has been very successful because of that decoupling. One of the things that's great about compute is that you're able to choose, what vendor you want to buy hardware from. So that could be a Dell or an HP or a Supermicro or a Quanta. And of course, you get to choose the operating system that you want to put on it, whether that's a Debian or a BSD or Windows or whatever the case may be. And lastly, the application. So that could be a MongoDB or MySQL or SQLite or whatever is appropriate. And we really haven't had that choice in networking. So there's a number of organizations that have taken different approaches that are very friendly to automation. I work for one called Cumulus Networks, and essentially the summary that I gave for our product is that it's Linux unencumbered. So it looks and feels like a server. Pika 8 has a great product that offers a lot of different direction in terms of, do you want to do traditional networking, or do you want to do kind of SDN style networking with OpenFlow? And Big Switch has a really nice offering too, where they're really focused on providing a base open Linux distribution for these bare metal switches and routers. So again, we're seeing some innovation coming from a very different direction, not from traditional vendors, but from startups that have a product that's molded around making the user empowered as much as possible. So I want to talk a little bit about the business drivers, and then we'll introduce our panelists and start the discussion here. I think one of the things that's interesting is when you look at history and the DevOps movement, that's a really strong word. DevOps to a lot of people means a lot of different things. To me, ultimately, DevOps is uniting different parts of the organization under a common goal. And typically that common goal is enabling the business. That's also known as shared responsibility. So DevOps doesn't mean that the network team and the developers and the operations team all standardize on the same tool, but at the end of the day, they all agree on a common mind share. We're all going to take responsibility. I think that's a very kind of broad and easy definition that most people can agree upon. But DevOps, again, is again, a very vague and large term, but if we scope it as enabling the business to be more agile and more responsive to the needs of the business, it's a great way to frame essentially that movement, if you will. And this has been going on in compute pretty much since the beginning of my career. You know, there was a time where you had folks that were known as tools developers. They would write Perl scripts, or they would use things like CF Engine or M4 or scripting languages to automate as much as possible their SunOS and their Linux and their BSDI machines. So that was quite some time ago. And now the compute space and infrastructure in general has more of a cloud infrastructure manager outlook, if you will. So what that means is that you're expected to be a generalist. You're expected to know a little bit about the application layer, a little bit about the networking layers, and a little about the lower layers. And we see this across the compute industry having a lot of benefits. That means that the organization can move very fast and very agile. So the slide talks a little bit about what's driving that. In those environments, compute has to spin up and down very rapidly. The network has the same requirements. Rancid, is great technology, but it's typically used as a one-way sync. That would be completely unacceptable in a compute environment, to just push something out without a feedback mechanism. This is not within the ethos, if you will, of DevOps. So what's changed? Well, users are now really demanding respect from their vendors, right? So there's startups and there's traditional vendors that are responding to this demand in various ways. Some of them are developing proprietary APIs or NMS or management software for this need. Others are participating in GitHub repositories and open source projects. So all vendors are definitely responding to this call, if you will. Again, some of the vendors that were mentioned, they take the approach of treat the network device as a compute device. So that means those tools run natively. So if your compute organization is using Puppet or Chef or Ansible or Salt or Go or Corn Shell or Bash or whatever the choice has been made, some of the startup organizations actually will allow those runtimes to run natively on networking equipment. And you even see traditional vendors picking and choosing. We believe Puppet and Python are useful. We'll add it into our mainline product. And the last point to make there is that of all of this, the summary is that the business has been united on the operations side and the development side. Network is still the silo, and they need to come into that fold as much as possible. So hopefully that sets the stage a little bit about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to move on to introduction slides from each of the panelists that will talk a little bit about their organization, their personal experience with automation, and essentially kind of a summary or a statement of the experience they've had, not necessarily in the current organization, but over their career. So we're going to start off first with Carlos. You want to get started here, and I will. Sorry.
I'm here.
I'm still waking up. We all have glasses and plaid, if you don't notice, so I haven't had my coffee yet here.
So they asked me to say a little bit about myself. I'm a network engineer at Dyn. I'm active in different teams, but one of the main priorities this last year was to focus on network automation. Before Dyn, I was at ISC. Before that, I was at the University of Oregon. Part of that was with the NSRC, a lot of traveling, helping emerging regions with network infrastructure. I wouldn't call myself a software engineer. I'm more of a network engineer, but I can write code when I need to, and that's been really helpful. I like open source. I wrote a tool called NetDot that some people really like. It's a mix of a IPAM with network inventory. And I'm from the Dominican Republic, but that wasn't tropical enough, so I moved to New Hampshire. About Dyn, Dyn is the main theme is internet performance, and it's basically three areas: the advanced DNS services, email delivery, and more recently, internet intelligence. It's based in New Hampshire, but it's becoming a global company because we have more and more presence in other places. And we have about 20 data centers in 5 continents. The state of automation at Dyn is that there's a lot of ongoing automation already on compute and application. The continuous integration concept is very much part of the mindset, and we're growing and improving very fast in this area. We've been focusing a lot on automation. But as of last year, there was no automation or very little automation on the network side, so that's why we started this project called Kipper. Sorry.
Move on to Bronwyn's introduction here.
So my name's Bronwyn Lewis. I work at Packet Clearinghouse right now. I have a pretty varied background in various technical areas from market research companies. I also studied international affairs in New York when I decided I need a little career break there. And then I've been at Packet Clearinghouse as a provisioning engineer for about the last 15 months. It's been quite the crash course in all things compute and networking. I've always been a nerd. I know how to use Linux, that sort of thing, but I hadn't logged into a Cisco router prior to PCH. And my first Ansible playbook was actually just this last August, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So Packet Clearinghouse, some of you probably know it, some of you might not know it. It's a nonprofit based in the Bay Area, and we do a lot to support internet traffic and routing, research and operations, and we support a lot of internet exchange points around the world, particularly in the developing world. We do DNS Anycast, we do root name server mirrors. We have about now 100 locations globally, including places like, as I mentioned on here, Sudan and Vanuatu. So we go to some pretty crazy places, but we're also in more common places like LA and New York and Amsterdam and London. We're currently mostly Cisco equipment, but we're actually 100% networking Cisco equipment. And then just in this last year, since I've been with PCH 2014, we probably upgraded or newly deployed to about 40 different POPs, which I'm pretty much entirely responsible for. We have 2 other people on the provisioning team, but they're both kind of part-time. So current and future automation. Currently what we're doing is I'm using Ansible for templating the news sites. There's still a lot more work to be done there, but need to start somewhere, and starting small is better than not starting at all. We're doing a lot more automation with the server provisioning, and I'm working on some new and exciting things to, basically I want it to be as hands-free as possible. And eventually, for in the future, we want to do that with all of our sites. We want to do it so that any site that's currently in production can be easily upgraded. We won't need to have any fat fingering of configuration files or unnecessary manual IP calculation. And we just want to keep, automating as much as possible. And eventually, once we've kind of proved that with provisioning, which is very much offline, we want to push that to the NOC and make it something that we actually use in the operations and production environments.
Okay, and then we have Jerome from Cloudflare, which apparently this morning I thought was Carlos. I apologize there.
Is it working? Yeah, okay. Hey, I'm Jerome, network engineer at Cloudflare. So how I came to do automation, actually that was a long time ago, more than 10 years ago, when we had to deploy 1,500 routers in France. So in case you were wondering about my accent. So one day your manager comes into your office and says, hey, we have 3 years to deploy 1,500 routers in the nation. So how do you do that? And I was quite a noob at that time about automation. So I had to find a way to do it, and I did it in a dirty way. So I wrote a Perl script that was reading the Excel file from my project managers and generating the config file from there. So, and then you put a website in front of it so that people can just copy and paste the configs. And yeah, it's dirty. It's like, would you trust an Excel file to provision your network? Probably not. But at that time, actually, it worked. And that's when I realized, it made me realize that automation works, even when it's made dirty. So with Cloudflare, Cloudflare, maybe most of you know, it's a fast-growing CDN and security DDoS mitigation company. We have 32 POPs worldwide. We're adding new POPs all the time. We have more than 2,000 eBGP peering sessions. And the interesting part with that is it's a very easy task to automate. That's how we came to start automation at Cloudflare. Like this simple task, just create a template for an eBGP session. You can have many templates depending on the kind of advertisement you want to have. But then it's very easy to deploy new peering sessions. One thing, one thing we use a lot at Cloudflare is the flow spec. So there's been a lot of talks yesterday about flow spec. We do an extensive use of flow spec. We deploy tens of rules every day in the network. And the reason it needed automation is because the DevOps guys and the systems teams are analyzing what's happening in the network using SFlow and NetFlow, not the network guys. And they know what is a bad traffic and what rules we need to put. On the network side, we don't know about it. So we needed a way to help our colleagues and give them a way to provision the network. So it's kind of a self-protecting network where they analyze the traffic and they provision the network according to what they want. And the other part about flow spec is that if you keep adding rules every day in your routers, a new flow spec rule, then at some point your router will going to crash, because sometimes we went up to 1,000 flow spec rules in every router, and it doesn't scale. So you have to build a system to keep track of all those flow spec rules and find a way to expire them. So at Cloudflare, we have thousands of servers doing all the same job, serving HTTP and DNS requests. That's a very easy task to automate for my colleagues. But on the router side, all our collocations are different. We have different vendors. We have different router performances, different transit, different routing policies, especially when you do anycast routing. So that side is very difficult to automate. So my view on the automation, I talked about how I did it 12 years ago, and I should be ashamed of that. But because when you look at what's available now, you can build a view of your network very easily now. You have a lot of frameworks available for that. They provide you an integration with database and language and web views, all that integrated in the same framework. And sometimes you don't even know how to code. I encourage you to try those frameworks, actually. And what we see now is that, especially we see that at Cloudflare, is that the DevOps guys are trying to teach us, the network guys who are not developers and we don't have that culture, they're trying to teach us how to use their practices in the network. The problem with the network today is that the vendors are probably not yet fully aware that we need automation. And the netconf support, for example, is like, it's terrible. If you exclude Juniper, I mean, it's not really well supported, and the new vendors are really trying to introduce new ways to configure the network, and they don't want to support netconf, obviously. So I don't know if netconf is going to die, but it's definitely not the best solution today if you're in a multi-vendor environment. And my other view on that is that we definitely need a common API, a simple to use API that would allow us to program all of our devices completely vendor agnostic. And I hope someday the vendors will hear me and produce that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, Jerome. So we're going to start off with some kind of initial teaser questions, if you will. And first of all, I want to thank the panelists for participating this morning, and also for their organizations being supportive. We reached out to a number of organizations that are represented at NANOG, and they didn't want to speak about networking and in terms of the automation, the frameworks that they use. So I really appreciate everyone coming here this morning. The first one relates to the cultural change when you're moving from kind of the cowboy mentality on your team to a automation approach. And the real challenge there is a lot of folks are not used to the idea of that workflow that Jerome, Carlos, and Brahman had all mentioned. This idea of this kind of DevOps tool chain has a very distinct skill set required for it. Not only kind of Linux basic skills, but some level of scripting or familiarity, and certainly templating languages or schema that has to be made comfortable with. So it's a pretty big change, and I think one of the things in particular that's interesting about networking in particular for a lot of service providers versus kind of a Web 2.0 company is that the operations team is not the only consumer of that data, right? There may be billing or a NOC team. The NOC may be at a different location. So there's a lot of different folks that have to take responsibility for that data. So I'm going to pass it over to the panel here to talk about, again, the kind of cultural investment they've had to do to adopt automation. So you want to get started here? I guess we'll start off with Carlos here.
When I started throwing out ideas, people were pretty receptive, colleagues and peers. So they thought it was a good idea. I think the main challenge is not people agreeing with the idea, is the fact that some network engineers haven't had the opportunity or the need to work with some of these tools like version control and Git and Ansible, etc. So it's a bit of initial investment in time and training, but I think people want to improve and they see the benefit.
And I think would be interesting from Jerome's perspective is, when you were at the organization in France versus now at Cloudflare. I mean, Cloudflare is a very, very well-known young organization that has a lot of newer technology. Was it easier to propose some of these newer automation tools in that organization, or did you feel like, well, I'm back at that project manager, I've got to use an Excel sheet, that's what the rest of the work is comfortable with?
The culture has changed. So it's like, if you want to start doing automation on the network, nobody would block you from doing that. The thing is that the tools that my colleagues use, especially Salt, there's nothing available for the network for Salt today. And the only way I can be compliant with the way the company does would be to build my own Salt modules. So I'm still waiting for the vendor to support that. And that's my main problem today. I don't have time to build that myself. I could definitely try Ansible, but then I'm diverging from what my company does. That's my main problem today. So nobody, they congratulate me when I'm doing automation, but it's not as well integrated as I wish.
And I think for Bronwyn, PSH has been in this industry for quite some time. I could imagine that the distributed nature of the organization and the fact of the variety of hardware, even though it's from a single vendor, the vintage of that hardware could be fairly challenging. Potentially also the vintage of people's knowledge around some of these tools is rooted in some of those older platforms. So how's that journey been at PCH for you?
Yeah, those have definitely been challenges at PCH. I'm very, very lucky in that I have a lot of autonomy. It's a very small organization. There's probably about 25 employees worldwide. with the provisioning team based in Berkeley and the NOC based in Kathmandu, but we also have people in Argentina and London and kind of all over the place with various, technical sets of knowledge. But I've had a lot of autonomy, so I was actually very lucky in that I was able just to kind of, oh, well, I got my work done for the day, so now I can just focus on whatever I want to focus on, which really enabled me to do some research into different automation tools and then just pick one and run with it. So I kind of did everything in a silo initially, got the initial thing running, and then showed it to my coworkers and was like, hey, check this out. We went from doing something that took us hours to it's 5 minutes once you input the variables, which is pretty awesome. But it's a unique situation in that case.
I think a good follow-up question for Jerome and Carlos along that lines is that, were you tasked by your management to solve this problem, or was it kind of self-directed? I know that each of your organizations is obviously slightly different, one on the CDN side, one on the DNS side. But again, was the culture, the management supportive, or was it a ground up or kind of a combination?
I was not tasked by my management to do it, and obviously the management doesn't care at all. What the management wants is the network to work. And sometimes they're pissed because you should have deployed that new collocation last week and it's not done yet. So if you come up with a new solution that involves automation and it can be done in a day, they will be very happy. But they don't really care about automation. They're still seeing us, network engineers, are operational engineers.
I think that's a really good point, is that, traditional network engineers were really kind of siloed in the scope of what they were responsible for. But clearly, as we can see at NANOG, there's a data center track, there's a peering track, there's DNS, there's security. A lot of us wear a number of hats, both men and women in the field, in this industry. But I think you're right. Some organizations just see you as, you route packets, right? You're not above or below that layer. So I think it's a really good point. What about for you, Carlos?
Well, as I said, there was a strong focus on automation, and as soon as I joined, my boss said that he had already identified that network automation was a big need. It's something that I probably would have found out if not told, but that's how it happened.
Great. And I think one of the things that Jerome mentioned was that the tool set that the compute team used is SALT, I believe, which is a fairly popular open source DevOps tool. In the case of Dyn, were you already using Ansible on the compute environment, or did you choose to use a separate tool?
The main tool there is Chef. So I looked into doing this with Chef, but it just didn't seem possible. It seemed very limited. There's another team using Salt, and there's another team using Ansible. So we have a bit of everything. But it wasn't easy. It wasn't hard to convince people that we need to use a tool that worked best for the particular problem. And it wasn't an issue. And once you understand the concepts of configuration management, it's not hard to go from one to the other. These domain-specific languages are very similar. Yeah, you need to maybe move from Ruby to Python, but again, languages are very similar too. So it hasn't been a problem in the way that we use different tools for different solutions.
And this kind of segues into the next question in terms of the culture being supportive either at the management layer or your peers within your team, but also the knowledge or the prerequisites to be successful. I guess we'll start off here with Bronwyn. When you look at kind of the DevOps movement, there's kind of this vision of building something, testing it, releasing it, and this continuous integration pipeline. And that doesn't always translate into a service provider world. And I can imagine, with the three organizations represented on the panel today, everyone has a slightly different workflow. You know, I could naively say that Dyn would want to add capacity for demand to be able to scale their DNS infrastructure. Same with Cloudflare, that they would want to scale for demand as the product grows and matures and gets more adoption. But in the case of PCH, it's a little bit different, where you're putting deployments out geographically spread for redundancy and essentially critical internet infrastructure. So it's a little bit of a different focus. Did you find that the organization were they already aware of some of these technologies and different pockets of the operations team? And was it easy to get your peers, as you mentioned, based in Berkeley, to learn these tools and adopt them? Or has it still been kind of, you know, Bronwyn's little domain, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the really important things is that I'm just dealing with provisioning at the moment in terms of automation. So the NOC has their own kind of like home-built tools that they're using. But in terms of the provisioning team, I think one of the really important things was documentation. I did a lot to document very, very well everything that I did, every step of the way. So when it came time to share it with the other people on the provisioning team, it's a no-brainer. Like, I just pulled up Ansible, I was like, here, check this out, typed in playbook, ran it, it generated all these configs for all of these different sites that we had deployed recently, and they were just wowed by it. And then when they were like, oh, this is awesome, how do we do this? Okay, here's the Git repository where I have everything checked in, here's a Git cheat sheet, and here's an Ansible cheat sheet. This is all you need to know to make this work. So you don't really even need to know how to use any of these tools to start. You can learn them very easily. So if you've never used any of these things, you can do it. When I first started with provisioning, it was a combination of manually entering all of the different configs, and it's a consistent config for the new sites that we deploy, and then we customize them at the different sites. But it's the same config for me to deal with. And we had someone had written, you know, like a Python substitution script, and so we were using that for a while, but all of the IP calculation was manual. There's a lot of unnecessary work and potential for fat fingering and just general human error. You might, you know, accidentally enter in the wrong IP address, and then it's replaced everything in that config, and oh, you know, I gotta do everything over again now, oops. So I think that, yeah, I think the tools are very, very important. And you want to pick the right ones for your organization. I did a lot of research beforehand about what was available and what I thought might be best for both provisioning and in the future what we might be able to adopt for operations and for the NOC. But yeah, I think as long as you like document and you start small, you can teach anyone this stuff. Anybody can learn it.
That's great. I mean, I think one of the things that was interesting there is the strong message of documenting to enable your peers to be successful. And I liked how Jerome was mentioning that, you know, back when he wrote the embarrassing, you know, Excel script that would take that data, you also mentioned a website component to it. So it sounds like, you know, even at that time, you were working on an effort to advertise at least this automation to a wider audience. Again, it wasn't just like only one person knows how to run the script, but the data is available. Can you give us some examples, you know, within your organization, how that works on both the network side and on the compute side in terms of kind of sharing that knowledge? Is it, again, just a README file, or is there some formal training? Again, both on network and compute side, kind of contrast those, if you will.
Yeah, it's mostly, as you said, a README file. So every code that we write or every software that we deploy, we put that in the Git repositories. People are supposed to go there and check how it works, and we're supposed to write documentation. It's not always done, but I think it's mostly a cultural problem. Usually NetOps are not software developers, so they don't like to write documentation. Everybody does that, knows that. It's pretty straightforward. We have a wiki to write documentation, and all the rest is done in the Git repositories. I think the main challenge for the network engineer is to learn how to use Git, which is it's not a popular tool for network network engineers, not at all. It's very popular now in the DevOps world, but it's definitely not in the NetOps. I had to train a lot of my colleagues to actually use Git properly.
Yeah, I think that's a great point that both Jerome and Brahman have made in terms of finding the right tool that's appropriate for your organization and not just kind of shoving it down their throats. Essentially, this panel is a follow-up from the talk that I had at the last NANOG around building the temporary event network for Burning Man. The PC asked for more content around automation. Obviously, working at a vendor as my daytime job, didn't want to do a product pitch. I wanted to get some diversity of different organizations using automation for different parts of their day-to-day operations, if you will. And I think that's really interesting around the usage of some of these common technologies. I mean, you all have mentioned Git, you've all have mentioned scripting languages, that sort of thing. And at least in the Burning Man example, I mean, Git has been really powerful for us because as we're out in the field deploying equipment, we don't necessarily have network internet access. So we're able to change a template or some variables, commit it, and then when we get back online, we're able to merge it, and so we can work in a distributed fashion. And I think that's really powerful. I mean, one of the things that's great about Git compared to some of the other version control systems like RCS or Subversion or CVS and that sort of thing, is that distributed nature that you can work offline. So a pro tip there, if you want to do some of your automation when you're on the plane or you're sitting in an airport, Git is one way certainly to facilitate that. So I want to move on to the next question around standards, and hopefully we'll get maybe some vendor praising and maybe some vendor bashing just for amusement here. And we'll start it off, I think, with Jerome in terms of the experience that you've had in the past with NetConf and other standards, particularly around using this in a multi-vendor environment. I know you've mentioned using both traditional networking suppliers and also some startup organizations, and you've had kind of mixed success in terms of whether NetConf was fully supported or even fully QA'd.
Yeah, so when I first started automations years ago, the NetConf wasn't available at all. And I think it started in 2006, maybe in the Juniper. And so NetConf, when it arrived, it was a godsend because before that, I had to do screen scrapping, and I was even uploading the config using a SNMP set. Who uses SNMP set anyway? So NetConf was definitely an improvement over what you had available before. And at that time, XML was considered as the de facto standard. And so nobody questioned that. I think the main problem of NetConf today is that the protocol has barely evolved in years and that the DevOps community doesn't want to use XML at all. And if we want to get some help from the DevOps community, we need to make this protocol evolve in some way. The other thing with NetConf is that it's barely a translation of your config in XML. And there's no abstraction layer on top of that. And that's what we need to have this multi-vendor capacity. So we really need the vendors to sit around a table and decide of evolution of this protocol, I think. That's my opinion, but I might be wrong. Yeah.
I think that Carlos mentioned in your presentation earlier this week around Juniper is one of the main platforms that you support, and their standard CLI essentially is going to compile down to an XML represented config anyways. So you started your templates around that XML structure. Can you talk a little bit about how that's different than, say, the screen scraping approach? Does the vendor provide DTDs or XSDs so you can validate that syntax? How is it to prototype that? Did it just work reliably versus their human readable CLI, if you will?
Yeah, certainly Juniper has made my work really much easier than what other people have. Yes, the representation internally is XML, and that means that you do have the option to download their XSD, I think that's the name, the schema definition, and you can actually use that potentially even before you talk to the device, because you can load that in your workstation while you're compiling or building your configs, and you can see if they pass the syntax. We haven't done that yet. I think it's possible. But I had the choice of representing the config in XML or in set commands or in the curly bracket standard format. But XML made more sense for me because if I produce an XML document, it's something that is very easily parsed with any language. And once I have a data structure, I am free to build any kind of policy checks that I want. I can make sure that every filter that is defined is applied in an interface, or some of the examples that I gave on Monday. So that was definitely useful. I myself don't find XML so annoying. It's a matter of getting used to it. Maybe because I did a lot of HTML when I started in the 90s. Yeah, I mean, if netconf, the netconf standard adopts JSON and that is friendlier to other people, definitely. Something they should do. But the main problem here is vendor support. I mean, we really need a standard API. And I know there's work going on in defining common data models with Yang so that it's similar to what was done with SNMP, where if you want to obtain or modify the interface list and details, it's standard, and you do it the same way in any device. That's important, but I think even before that, it's important to just support the protocol so that you can get the config, send the config, have the capacity to compare a candidate config with a production config, and that would be really useful.
Great. And Brahman, you mentioned that the PCH organization has a mixture of different devices, but almost 100% on the network side is Cisco. And so I can imagine you've got Nexus, you've got iOS, hopefully not any CatOS, but you've got quite a bit of different operating systems out there. And then on the server side, you've got different vendors there for different IPMI controllers and whatnot. So it seems like it's a pretty challenging task that not all of those have one of these structured schemas, if you will. So even if you're not a fan of netconf or XML or some sort of structure, it seems like in your case there's a few platforms that's not even an option. So what are some of the choices that you're looking at in your organization for making that successful on these legacy platforms? Do you wait until you can swap them out, or have you found libraries, or what's kind of the approach there?
Yeah, I mean, it's very challenging. I've been doing a lot of research on this because this is kind of the next area that I want to tackle in automation at PCH, is that with all that different Cisco gear, different ages, there's just nothing that's very consistent that I can do there. I mean, even with Ansible, it's agentless. You can just SSH in. That's awesome, but then you can't execute Python on any of the old Cisco gear. You can't do that in iOS. You can run Ansible in raw mode, but then you usually get one command in, and then it has a problem where it'll open another SSH session. So that's not going to work. So at this point, I mean, it looks like my best option is going to probably be CLI scraping, just given the wide variety of equipment we have. We have some very old equipment that's deployed, and then we're deploying a lot of new stuff. But just given the sheer number of sites that we have and kind of our limited budget and nonprofit status, we're not going to be able to upgrade a lot of stuff that quickly. We have to kind of pace ourselves and at the same time support brand new sites. So we're deploying new sites every month. So yeah, I think CLI scraping is probably going to be the best option. There are some other options, especially on newer Cisco equipment, such as 1PK, where you can actually execute Python, and you can do Puppet, and you can do it's increasing in in its scope and what you can do on it. But that's not going to work for any of our old legacy sites that are still waiting to be upgraded. So it's definitely a challenge, and there are a lot of good libraries out there. I mean, that's one great thing about kind of this movement of network automation is there's a lot of good blogs. There's people on Twitter that will chime in and that you can tweet at and like get help. There's a lot of libraries on GitHub. There's not a one size fits all. You do have to do your research when you're faced with a challenge like this. You have to try things out. You have to experiment. But I think it's going to eventually get there. It would be amazing if, like, to echo everyone else on this panel, we could have just a standard API. We could have standard ways to do all of this two-way interaction with networking equipment. I think that's critical to the future of networking, and to scale and to, you know, all these situations. Yeah, it's not easy, but it's completely worth doing.
That's great. I mean, my personal career background was more in building networks, but now I work for a vendor, and it's interesting seeing kind of the summary that I think that everyone gave in the panel with this respect, that as a vendor, you know, we saw that a lot of organizations prefer layer 2 networking because it's easy. I can outsource that problem to virtual chassis or VPC or MLAG or whatever. And this layer 3 routed stuff is difficult. Now, I know that may be laughable in this crowd, but a lot of the folks that I interact with in my day job were really scared of layer 3 networking until about a year ago, and things kind of changed. And I think it's very similar where, you know, on the vendor side, the vendors provided NetConf and Yang and SNMP, these really heavyweight protocols, if you will. And finally, people have kind of come around and said, look, I just want to interact in a structured API that's simple and easy to understand, that I can use a tool set that the rest of my organization is familiar with. And so it's interesting how when you look at a vendor-driven technology and how it gets adopted in the marketplace versus what users want, you know, 5 or 10 years after, maybe something much, much simpler or much, much complicated. So it's a really interesting how, you know, all three you're asking for vendors to improve support, but make that simple. And if you were to summarize that, is in the best case scenario, if NetConf and Yang and some structured XML is too heavyweight, for example, would this multi-vendor support be essentially a RESTful API with some JSON structure that's consistent across the different vendors? Is that the ideal scenario that the three of you are looking for? Or is it something simpler? Is it CSV files? Is it, you know, something more complicated? And I guess we can start with Jerome on that.
Don't go too simple, like not CSV file, but yeah, REST API is definitely great. I think we're all looking for that. I mean, it's so simple. It's like if you're a Python developer, you can just get the structure directly in your code. Instead, I mean, if you have ever passed XML in Python, I mean, you know that it's much easier to deal with JSON. So yeah, that's pretty much what I'm looking for. Yeah.
I'll completely second that. I mean, it gives a lot more options to different people. If you're not comfortable with one language, you've got other options then. So you're not locked into learning just one thing. I think that's really important to get, you know, this network automation adoption going throughout the world.
I would be happy if I just had NetConf everywhere. I don't even care if the models are different. I can generate different configuration models based on the same data using different templates. I just want a way to do the same operations everywhere without having to change, you know, write a different module for Cisco Gear and another module for Arista and another module for, you know, whatever. It's not that hard.
Great. Yeah, I think the summarize there is that the transport, you know, at least for you know, Bronwyn and Jerome, is HTTP is great, JSON is great. What's missing is that consistent schema between vendors. And on Carlos's side, that already exists. If all the vendors would just step up with the kind of existing protocol that's available there. So this will be our last prompted question, and we'll have about 5 minutes from the audience to take some questions. For all the panelists here, what are some of the future directions of automation and the networking space? I think one of the things that's interesting is that in all three examples here, all of you mentioned the idea of, I started off with something that was basic or embarrassing or simple. You had the software you developed at the university. For Carlos, Jerome had the Excel script that was parsed to generate configs, and in Bronwyn's case, a very simple Python script that just searched and replaced variables, but didn't do any validation or any calculations, if you will. And then you move the bar pretty far forward, but there's obviously a lot more to go. So is Ansible the end-all be-all tool for that? Is it doesn't matter about the tool, it's the schema? Can't the industry get together there? Is it, well, why don't we all just use switches that ran Linux so we could just have those native tools that are available on compute? There's a lot of different directions here. So if you were to kind of predict where you would like to see the industry go, either personally for yourself or for your organization, would love to hear about that. Maybe start off with Jerome again.
I can't really comment on Ansible because I've never really used it. I can comment on Sprockets because right now, if you look at the website, it's advertising the future of NetOps, but that's what I can read. So I had this kind of vision yesterday where I was committing my config on the router, and it was Git compliant, so the config was automatically pushed to my repository somewhere. I think that's something I would love to have, and that's what I can see for the future now.
Great.
That would be pretty awesome. I want to see that too. I mean, I really want to see all of the things on this slide happen. Like, I really like that. I mean, Ansible, as it exists today, particularly for equipment such as Cisco, is not the end-all be-all. I'm excited about Sprockets based on what I've heard about it, because right now I'm faced with a variety of tools that I'm going to have to use. It's going to be a situation for a lot of people right now. I don't want to have to use homegrown scripted stuff. I would much rather have a solid framework that I could use across the board. So I'm excited to see where Sprockets goes. And yeah, I mean, I'd like to see the other options too, Linux and a REST API. I think that'd be amazing.
Great.
Yeah, and I think I hinted at this on Monday. I see two trends. One is we go more and more towards white boxes and more Linux-based stuff where we're going to end up configuring things the same way we configure Apache or something. And the other trend I see is especially for data center networks, where the people are with OpenStack and the like. We're making the network, the traditional thing that we call the network, simpler and simpler. We're moving a lot more of the logic and the intelligence to the hypervisor, and so the need for automating the network will be less and less relevant.
That's great. So we'll take questions from the audience. Randy, do you have a question? I don't control that microphone, so if I did, I would delegate that.
Boopity boop. There we go.
There you go.
Randy Bush, IIJ. First, I think there are three layers. One is the vendors and all their specificity and the fact that they are not going to do commonality because then they don't have anything to sell. The middle layer, which is what you've mostly been talking about, is how to transport and shove junk down there. And we've got many generations of it. I will notice that you don't mention at all the IETF's latest snake oil for this Yang. I'm not advocating it. I think it's just another horrible compromise to try to paste over vendor specificity. And three, there's the trying to do abstract layers on top. And again, The vendor snake oil you haven't mentioned of the generation is SDN. Can't I just push all these things magically out to some nice drawing I make of my network? And of course, that belies vendor specificity, and it's also snake oil. We've been trying to model networks for 40 years, not successfully. So I think we're in a corner. I mean, I had to listen to a presentation at RIPE where a large global ISP described their configuration system, which was some whitewash over the temporary hack I did in that company 20 years ago, right? We're in a real mess. And so we have some better tools, but the vendor specificity is always going to kill us. And they're going to fight to differentiate. And they're not, Carlos, they're not going to implement, you know, XML everywhere for us. And they're not going to implement Yang or JSON or whatever. We're in a trap.
Thank you, Randy. Any comments from the panelists there?
On that uplifting note, I mean, yeah, like Randy's right. I guess I'm hopeful. I mean, we have the SNMP example that wasn't great. I mean, it wasn't 100%. It wasn't perfect, but all of us used SNMP, and a lot of vendors did implement the IF-MIB and the IP-MIB, et cetera, and the BGP-MIB, and so we were able to monitor our networks with one tool. I don't see why we can't get closer to that with configuration management.
I mean, change is hard everywhere, and especially when it comes to major vendors and it comes to major organizations locked into those vendors. But I have to hope that eventually more and more people will be able to move to options that allow more openness if vendors aren't willing to accommodate it.
Carlos, monitor is interesting, and I'm not disagreeing with you. We all live with that in SNMP. But how many people in this room have routers with SNMP right enabled?
Yeah, for the remote audience, it's about 5 or 6 hands. We've got a question in the back here.
Two specific comments. Steve Ulrich, Juniper Networks. On a more sanguine note around the IETF's efforts around Yang, it's probably worth noting that this is, a good faith effort in order to provide a common schema or a model for folks to actually write to. I think a lot of the initial frustrations expressed there were, having to translate one vendor's config foo into, something. And, maybe that's not the biggest source of heartburn, but there are efforts underway there. And Yang is simply a modeling language, a mechanism to express the intent there. On another note, there are other initiatives underway, vendor independent, which are being taken in order to provide some of that consistency and drive towards specific use cases. And I'll point out OpenConfig and some other initiatives which are kind of perhaps to the consternation of some, driving to different layers in the management infrastructure, but defining a common means to accomplish most of the day-to-day tasks that you're after. It's worth looking at those initiatives.
Great, thank you. I want to get one other comment here from the field.
Is this working? Yeah, there it is. Chris Elliott, ex-Cisco employee, ex-HumanWorks employee. I am here building the network. I have a good friend that works for Arista. They are finally looking at implementing RESTconf. What Bill has been telling me for a long time is there hasn't been the demand from their customers. So you all, if you want this kind of thing, ask your vendors, because they do listen. You may have to yell several times and have a bunch of your friends also yell, but they do respond to that. And these things are coming. It just takes a lot longer than we want.
Great, and we have time for one last comment or question.
So this is kind of like a question to everybody. A big part of I think everybody's networks is, defining automation, right? Because there have been a few talks about this. So one of the things that keeps coming up in my vendor talks is a project called Open Daylight. It integrates OpenFlow and 1PK for Cisco stuff. And I'm by no means an expert on this topic. So I'm kind of posing the question to you all, who I'm hoping are, what's your or have you used Open Daylight? Do you think it's a good solution for this? I know it's kind of marketed as a SDN solution, and I know a lot of us don't really like SDN. But I'm curious to hear what you guys in the field are doing, if anything at all, with Open Daylight and 1PK.
I mean, I'm not doing anything with it yet, but I'll take a look at it.
I've started taking a look at it, but nothing concrete.
I can't really comment on that. As far as I understand, it's been a stack for OpenFlow, and it's more about SDN rather than real automation, as far as I understand. So,
Yeah, I mean, as a vendor, we're supportive of OpenFlow and different efforts within that space. So I'll refer to our website on that. Time for one last comment in the back.
Sure. My name is Aaliyah Atlas, Juniper, and also routing AD for IETF. As I hear you on NetConf, and I'm wondering how familiar people are with RESTConf. It's currently being developed, and obviously different vendors are looking at that. We are also having what I would describe best as an explosion of interest in Yang, and looking at how to handle a lot of those different models and connect them up. This is a really great time for operators to, contribute. I agree that there are going to be vendor extensions to some of the models, but what we're trying to do is to get, say, the common 80% that aren't vendor specifics, to at least get some common base models, and then assume you're going to have extensions on top of that. Also, Yang's a modeling language, there's lots of them. It seems to work pretty well. If there's a lot of preference away from XML, it would be really nice to understand what you'd like to translate or have your models communicated in. I've heard protobufs, you can translate, it's not a problem, right? We just need to define a reasonable standard to do it so we're all agreed and we're not getting 5 different ways of translating. So, as I would ask, if you want to see common models and have opinions on how they're going to interact, come talk to me, come participate in the IETF. This is really a good time to try and get this stuff happening. There is a lot of interest. A lot of the drafts that are being written from a lot of different vendors trying to collaborate. We're hearing loud and clear that there's a crying need for this to improve the automation, and I'm delighted that we're finally at that point. But it's also not trivial to do.
Great. Thank you. We're running out of time here, so I wanted to thank all the panelists and their organization. If everyone can give them a round of applause, I'd really appreciate it. Okay. Thanks very much.